Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Muhi Khwaja, and we are chatting with Dr. Rania Awaad. We're on the Muslim Philanthropy podcast at American Muslim Community Foundation. Thank you for tuning in. And Dr. Rania Awaad, please introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me on this podcast, Muhi. I'm happy to be here. Professionally, I'm a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. There, I direct something called the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab. Mental health is a topic I'm really passionate about. And I then take some of that academic work into the community, and I'm the clinical director of the Khalil Center locally.
Sorry, I did the same thing with Rami as well. Okay. I forgot to hit record on my device. It's recording over there. We literally fumbled on the same thing. So that's on me. So I apologize. Okay.
Do you want to just restart?
Yeah, we're going to.
I was like, did I say too many things? Okay.
No problem. All right. Okay, so both places are recording. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You're listening to the Muslim Philanthropy podcast. My name is Muhi Khwaja, and at American Muslim Community Foundation. Today, our guest is Dr. Rania Awaad. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'm happy to join you, Muhi. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, of course. Our family's trajectory goes back to our Michigan days, and I didn't know that I'd be following you out to the Bay Area back then.
Right.
I'm more familiar with your younger brothers. We went to college together, and Amar and I go motorcycle riding. So there's that.
Absolutely fun. Okay.
For sure. So tell us a little bit more about yourself. What brought you out to the Bay? What do you currently do?
Sure. I officially moved out to the Bay in 2009, but I've had some connection to the Bay probably from the early 2000s. I was invited first out here to be a visiting teacher in residence at the Zaytuna Institute that used to be at Hayward, California, before what now is Zaytuna College. And it was during that period of time in my life that I also met my now husband, Sheikh Rami Awaad. And because he's a California native, Californians never leave California. Yes, and every time I say that, he says, "Okay, you can blame me for Stanford too." So, Alhamdulillah. After I'm from the Midwest, like you mentioned, like yourself, and spent time in Michigan and went to med school in Ohio. But once we were married, I applied and Alhamdulillah, matched into residency out here at Stanford. So I've been here ever since.
Wonderful. So in terms of what you're doing at Stanford University, for those that don't know, there's the Muslim Mental Health Lab, and can you tell us a little bit more about all of that work?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, alhamdulillah. Basically, once I completed my psychiatry residency and fellowship, I really wanted to focus on the Muslim community. There wasn't any such work, like a lab or a mentorship of, formally or officially formed. And I really felt like that needed to happen. And so I'm, quite thankful that my department saw that as well. I was, brought onto the faculty and then basically created the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, which is an academic lab. It's has several lines of research. And I think at this point we have about 30 researchers in it, from doctorate to postdoctorate levels. Some who are still in their, studies, and some who are much more advanced. And all the research that happens there is related to various aspects within the Muslim community related to mental health. So if you think about, women's mental health, refugee mental health, social justice-based issues like Islamophobia, also other related things, that you may not think of directly. Like, we're really interested in the Islamic framing of mental health, Islamic understanding of mental health. We've developed and validated psychometric scales that are specific to Muslims. Often when you read research, it's very, very general, and it doesn't apply so well to Muslims. Sure. So we kind of custom tailor that. And then I have my favorite line of all, which is basically the historical line of research. That is us going back into the very primary sources from the beginning of Islam. So from the advent of Islam. We're talking about 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century, all the way to Ottoman Empire times, and pulling out all of the material that is related to mental health and mental illness from our Islamic history and heritage. We've had some amazing breakthroughs. I mean, really landmark papers that have actually changed the course of discussing the history of what psychology is, shifting it away from that very Eurocentric Western model of everything only started with Freud onwards, and actually going back into what's actually a very rich heritage and legacy. So it's really a very exciting time to be able to put all this together.
That's really exciting, and I think very important to have that not only scientific background, but then the religious and the social, and just having the whole scope understanding of what it means to be a Muslim in today's world, right? And using the context of the historical aspect of that as well. So
yes, bridging it to the modern, absolutely.
Yeah. You've obviously presented at like a lot of different academic conferences and things like that. So what has the response been at a lot of those after those conversations?
Really stellar. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think probably one of the more difficult conferences to present at are your kind of the largest associations, like the American Psychiatric Association or the American Psychological Associations, or the Conference on Religion and Medicine. There's some, definitely critics are probably the best way to put it. And they're not too sure about this concept of bringing faith into this sphere of psychology, which otherwise has been quite secular for a long time. But there is definitely a worldwide movement towards integrating the whole person, which means bringing your whole self into the room, which means also for faith communities, bringing your faith into the discussion. So It's been interesting, but where I have found the most success is being able to use, and this is why it's important to train, and both clinically and research-wise, kind of at these, if you will, at our elite universities, because you get this really wonderful platform for them to publish from and to write from. And some of it, if it's evidence-based, you can't really refute it, So it's, I'll give you the example of our work on al-Balkhi and, OCD work, which I think was one of the more landmark studies. And it's a 9th century work that we tried to translate, and it seemed really interesting and connected to what I would today call obsessive compulsive disorder, but written in the 9th century, right?
Wow.
And when we did a comparison between al-Balkhi's criteria for what he considered, like he classified, diagnosed, and considered treatments, and we brought the DSM-5, which is essentially what psychiatrists like myself diagnose folks with, he hit the nail on the head in each and every symptom.
Wow.
So when you present that at a conference or in a paper, and it's so clear like that, there is no way to turn that back, It's just, it really rewrites. I mean, we're essentially reclaiming our narrative as how advanced the Muslim society had been in understanding and treating mental illness and accepting it into the fold, and almost like reviving it.
Yeah. And to think like culturally in today's society, there's maybe like this taboo of like going to get mental health, right?
Right.
But to see it being such a historical significance at that time, and them researching those things, tell us a little bit more about like how you feel those documents were preserved, and then how even the university accesses those documents today.
Yeah, it was such an interesting process. The fellowship, during my fellowship, this is when I kind of took on the project. And honestly, it's because, and I think most Muslims will kind of understand this sentiment. You grow up being very proud of your Islamic heritage and history. We kind of do this thing where we pat ourselves on the back for that legacy that we have very little to do with, but we just pat ourselves on the back for it. And for good reason. I mean, all the advancements in science and medicine and humanities, right? But nowhere in that discussion had I heard anything related to mental health, right? And so when I entered into this field, it was Jeff Rami actually has a lot to do with how I even ended up in this field of psychiatry. But when I got here, I very much felt like, well, if they had all these other advancements in medicine, where are the mental health advancements, right? And that prompted looking at all the manuscripts and going into the traditional sources. And this is where, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a plan, because I was, the original stories, I was heading into OB. I was planning to become an obstetrician. Women's health was my interest, still is a strong interest. and my advanced training is actually in women's mental health. But but at the time, it was so interesting because having trained in Islamic studies, like having actually done a full course of Islamic Sharia studies, right? So all the time I spent in Damascus, the various ijazas that I hold, allowed that ability to access and understand the classical Islamic texts and understand their layouts,
Sure.
and also the classical Arabic to be able to go into very historical writings and try to make sense of what was being said.
Right.
So I would have never have guessed at that time one thing would lead to another, you know?
Sure.
But just like the rest of our texts, Islamically speaking, there's such a high emphasis on knowledge and seeking knowledge and preserving knowledge that a lot of these books and manuscripts are so well preserved over time and very, very carefully, copied, handwritten right before the printing press. And they're preserved in libraries all throughout the Muslim world. We found so many. Balkhi, for example, the fun backstory about Balkhi's manuscript was actually preserved at the Hagia Sophia in Turkey in its library for literally hundreds of years and not accessed. I mean, talk about like dusting off the the dust of time. Dr. Malik Badri, who's kind of the forefather of the modern day Islamic psychology movement, was the one to do this. And when he accessed this resource, it hadn't been touched for hundreds of years, right? But it was well preserved, almost like it was meant to be found again at the right time. SubhanAllah. Wow. So those are our texts. They're still there, and there's a lot of work to do. If I could have had, an entire lab and funding and work to actually do this, I think I'd spend the rest of my career literally trying to go back into our Torah, right, into our legacy, our heritage, to pull this all out.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about just like how you got to the point in which you wanted to dive into psychiatry, because you talked about like you had initial interest in OB and things like that. So like, tell us about like, education in your family. Like obviously your family is, your dad's a professor, right? And other stuff. So tell us a little bit more about that dynamic and what got you to that point.
My own background in all of this. Yeah, I guess I'd have to start the story from really teen years, because that's where the story starts, from going to formally study the Islamic sciences. Having moved to Michigan, as you know, there's a very strong and robust, if you will, Syrian community there. I was introduced to the concept of women scholars, and I'm so intrigued by this, especially as a young woman. Right, I was 14 when I took my first trip to Syria. That was really an amazing journey. And then I was so taken by all that was there, and everything from Quran to all the various Islamic sciences. And I basically called my parents from Damascus at 14 and said to them, I think I just want to stay here. And they were like, absolutely not. Your family there, what are you saying? You get back here right now. And we laugh at it now, but the reality is they actually put some pretty strong hurdles for me to get back to Damascus. They were really worried I was going to just give up all my studies. They had this vision of me becoming a doctor, and so we had a deal. If I kind of excelled in my studies, I'd get a trip back to Damascus, and that's I always joke when people say, "How did you get into such and such medical school?" And I'd say, "Trying to get to Damascus." And they're like, what? And so alhamdulillah, but basically the long Damascus, between high school, college, medical school,
Audio's cutting out.
Medical studies. And then from there,
so try
I wanted to.
So your audio cut out. Yeah, I think the audio is being weird. You're muted.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
Now I can. Yeah, I don't know how that happened.
I had no idea either. I didn't have the computer.
You were talking about
where how far back did you
hurdles to come back?
You left at the hurdles? So. Okay. Just pick up there again?
Yeah.
All right. So folks have put all these hurdles for me to get back to Damascus, kind of worried about me not completing my studies. And we had this deal that if I excelled in my studies, I'd be able to go back to Damascus. And so the long and short of it is I was able to get back and excel, essentially. I excelled in my studies trying to get to Damascus. But I really did take all these trips between high school, college, medical school, and even into my residency. I would go back and forth, kind of interweaving my Sharia studies into my, if you will, secular studies. And all the while, I had really thought, I'm really interested in women's health and women's, conditions. And the first thing that happened as soon as I finished medical school, I actually founded a nonprofit called the Rahmah Foundation. And its whole mission was to, I'm one of the co-founders, and the whole mission is to educate Muslim women and girls in the Islamic sciences.
Nice.
So essentially, a lot of the work I was doing in the community was teaching Islamic studies, teaching everything that all the subjects that I had ijaza or licensing to teach. And all of that community-based work, even though I was doing medicine in the background, all the community-based teaching and work opened doors that were really interesting. Like I realized very quickly that I could answer the questions that women were asking, like fiqh-related questions.
Sure.
Right? But as soon as you start teaching and answering questions in the community, in comes in a lot of personal questions and a lot of personal situations. And I realized very quickly, as much as I knew to answer fiqh-wise, I couldn't for the life of me answer some of these more complicated life scenarios.
Sure.
And at this time, Sheikh Rami also said, most anybody who's well trained to deliver a baby can deliver.
Yeah, you're just cutting in and out. It went on mute again.
I see the mute button, but I don't know what's touching the mute button.
No clue. So you cut out at Rami mentioning if somebody can.
Are you going to be able to edit all this, or is it going to be a pain for you to go back?
Yeah, it'll be fine. I'll be able to manage.
Okay.
So you were talking about how Sheikh Rami mentioned.
Can I just do this one thing real quick? I'm gonna minimize everything else.
Yeah.
Hoping that nothing else is kind of messing it up here.
No problem.
Maybe I'll make sure my cursor is far away from where the mic is.
So you were saying how he mentioned if anybody can deliver a baby, and then I think it started cutting out. Like if somebody could, so just start from there.
I always like to make sure that I give, props where props are due. And Sheikh Rami was very key in this. He had mentioned if, somebody's well trained to deliver a baby, anybody can do so. But his exact words were, you're trained in Islamic sciences. There are a lot of mental health conditions in the community. It's going to take someone who has both backgrounds to be able to really address the issues in our community. And subhanAllah, that kind of really pivoted my career very quickly, I have to say. I was towards the very end of my medical studies, had already done all these advanced rotations in OB, had all my letters written for OB.
Wow.
And even it was quite funny, even in my psychiatry interviews for residency, I had some people say, so are you becoming an OB or a psychiatrist? It was that late in the game. But subhanAllah, when Allah has something written and planned, it's doesn't matter how much we plan, right?
Right. And I think there's like such a calling to, somebody who has their, if you want to call it like life's work or things that they've prepared for in their life, and then to be actually able to do that professionally, I think is such a rewarding fulfillment. So props to you for kind of figuring that out so far. And it's exciting to see the work that is coming out of the Muslim Mental Health Lab and at Stanford. It really interested, like, was it part of their process in recruiting you or retaining you that you kind of said, like, this is what I would like to do? Or did the health lab kind of come out after that conversation as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have to say, Stanford is, it's a very, as you probably know, a very strong, biologically heavy research institution. And so even our Department of Psychiatry is heavily neuroscience, not so much so cultural psychiatry. And so early on in my, again, my trade, because I was there for training. So in my training, I would often get people saying things like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. we don't have anybody to train you, so why don't you go to Columbia or why don't you go to Duke? And in fact, for a few weeks, they actually sent me off to Duke, where I trained for a little while with Dr. Harold Koenig, who was kind of a pioneer in getting, faith-based psychotherapy going and, Christian psychology. So it was really helpful to have that, but there was very few anybody kind of working in the field of Muslim mental health.
Yeah.
And I was just adamant of like, if I'm going to stick in the field of academia, then I really want to have a platform that all who come after me can actually get that kind of training
Right.
and, academic kind of mentorship expertise to be able to then publish and continue on their careers. So it was definitely a dialogue, and coming onto the faculty, my first ask was, this is the research I've done. This is the lab that I want to open. And they said, have at it. So I'm very thankful that worked out.
Yeah, for sure. And then, I'm sure you're familiar with, and I've also presented at like the Muslim conferences that are related to psychology and psychiatry. So just kind of give like a overview of like what institutions or networks there are in this space.
In the last, I would say 10 years for sure, but certainly 5 years especially, there is just a blossoming of different networks. And I think it's really wonderful. The first on the scene probably was the Institute of Muslim Mental Health that puts on the Muslim Mental Health Conference and also holds the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. And so those are kind of some of the key organizations that popped up. The Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab comes on to kind of fill a more academic space. And, community-based education space. There's FYI, the Family Youth Institute. And then you have, actual clinical space. So the clinics where there's therapy. And that's where, Khalil Center, it really fills an important role because it's the largest provider of Muslim mental health services across the nation.
Nice.
Yeah.
So tell us about like this unique pairing that, the work that you're doing at Stanford is directly related to some of the services and things that are being provided at Khalil Center. So walk us through kind of like that relationship and kind of the role that you play there.
Definitely. This also goes back to discussing with my, department and saying, look, I'm really interested in the idea of academia. We need evidence-based research. And certainly the clinics are going to be great, but I have found for my own community that to come into, a big, Ivy League-esque institution like Stanford, for Muslims to seek out that kind of mental health care or even for research, it's not going to be enough to just sit in the ivory tower, if you will, and write and research about this topic. It needs that you go into the community and actually engage the community. And this is probably from my own community work that I've done for like years, right? Kind of very grassroots.
Yeah.
And so I was actually the first hire under the division, a newly formed division of Stanford on public mental health and population sciences. So basically community-based track. And so that was really great because it meant that I could split my clinical work from just in the department and then work that's actually in the community. So that is where the Khalil Center partnership started with Stanford University. And the Khalil Center has roots that go back about 10 years. They started in Chicago under the supervision of Dr. Human Kashavarzi, who's the executive director and founder. And Dr. Human and I, speaking at Muslim conferences, I was presenting at the Muslim Mental Health Conference one year. And after I presented, he took me aside and we literally missed the rest of the conference because he was telling me all about this model of the Khalil Center and all that they have started to pioneer in Chicago. And I basically said to him, look, if you have a really good model, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Like, we might as well bolster. And this is how I really feel strongly about Muslim work too. Like, work together, bolster what's already good and kind of make it excellent, right?
100%.
So, alhamdulillah, in 05, not 05, 2015, I don't know where 05 came from, sorry. 2015, we started the first branch outside of Chicago of the Khalil Center, just to see if it would work as a pilot. That was here in Santa Clara, California. And then from there, we booked up so fast that therapists started we had 2 rooms in a small suite, and they just started to book on top of each other that we realized, within a year, we opened up a second location. By the 3rd year, we opened up a 3rd location, started to contract out into colleges like UC Berkeley, where the main Muslim mental health therapists on their campus, like Tuna College, so on, Islamic schools.
Yeah.
So it became a scalable model. And I think that's what's really important here. Then, you know, New York opened up a branch, then Los Angeles opened up a branch, and Toronto opened up a branch, and now there's the first experimental branch internationally in Istanbul as well.
That is phenomenal. And I'm such a big fan of collaboration, and like when you can see it work as a really successful model, that's really inspiring. So kudos to the Khalil Center team. So at this point, like obviously, you know, representing American Muslim Community Foundation, and wanted to see in your nonprofit experience, you talked about like Rahmah Foundation, you talked about Stanford and the Muslim Mental Health Lab and these other umbrella institutions for Muslim mental health, and of course the Khalil Center. So when did, like, obviously we only started in 2016, but like when did you see the impact, or I guess entrance of AMCF into those spaces as well?
I think actually very soon after you started. I remember we met at Stanford and talked a little bit about the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab and the kind of work of the various different projects happening within the lab, and how it was, you know, one thing in academia we struggle with a little bit is being able to get the essentially translate over the work we do and disseminate and get it to the community to understand and to know what the kind of work that we do. So I know that was a dialogue we had. And since then, I've seen, you know, you all kind of in all different aspects of nonprofit and community work, which I really appreciate.
Cool, thank you. And then in terms of like, we define philanthropy as the love of mankind, right? So in the grand scope of things, like you could even interpret what you're doing every day to be philanthropy, right? So what does philanthropy mean to you?
You know, this is a very kind of deep and personal place. I have to say, I'll tell you something. When I was in Syria, and it ties back to your question, when I was in Syria, I on every trip, and I took multiple trips, alhamdulillah, but on every trip, when I would leave, I would say to the teachers, please make dua, I want to come back, I really want to, you know, and they would say, they would literally kind of, their style of teaching is very much like, you know, push you out the door and get out there and, you know, right out the nest, right, you know, expand your wings and learn to fly kind of thing, which is beautiful. And they just have this concept of like, which is a very Islamic concept of the amana, the responsibility that once you have to give, right? There is an element of once you have, Allah has given you something, you have to then pay forward part of it as well. And that is something I appreciated, whether, you know, charity comes up, as you know, in all forms, philanthropy comes in all forms, of course. Yeah. Here we're talking more monetary, but it also comes in time, knowledge, you know, effort. And so that's been a really, I think, probably a cornerstone for me of like the work that I do. I always feel this responsibility, this amana. If you've been given something, you have to pay part of it forward. And sure, similar to our zakat, similar to our sadaqah, right?
Yeah,
same concept here.
If you could solve one issue in the world, what would it be?
Wow, deep questions. Mashallah. I would definitely have to say, you know, the people connecting to the divine. I know there's the common answers of poverty and peace, world peace, and so on, and those are of course very important. But I do think that some of the healing spiritually that we find comes actually from knowing the divine and having a connection to him. And when that happens, it's almost like that is the essence and everything else is the symptoms, right? That comes from it. So having that connection deeply and really getting people not to have a connection with God or with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a place of fear or a place of, you know, just hand-me-down religion, right? Sure. An actual personal like connection then helps put everything else into perspective and actually does solve both the internal ailments, right, of the disease of the heart, but also the external manifestations of that, like poverty, like war, and so on and so forth.
For sure. And, you know, we're here recording in Ramadan, right?
First day.
Yeah, like what better time than now to have that introspection? And unfortunately, like for me, and I think that many other people are in the same boat, but like at least in Ramadan, there's this sense of there's this switch that turns on that's like, okay, now's the time. And it sucks because you have the entire year to do that, right? But it's something that I hope and that I continue to work on for myself, especially in Ramadan, where I can try to find that divine connection as well.
Definitely, definitely. And I can't help but, really make this observation that we are sheltered at home at this
Right.
particular kind of COVID Ramadan.
Yeah.
And the earth is healing out there without us in it.
Mm.
And that this is a chance, almost like divinely given chance when you look at it, silver linings and cup half full versus half empty, but that we are at home in an isolation, but that isolation can turn into a spiritual seclusion, right? An actual place of peace.
Yeah.
So all of my spiritual teachers, I have to tell you, they're like, finally, you all have the chance to grow spiritually and sit yourself down and actually connect, in that very deep inward turning, introspective journey. Yeah. I hope we come out of this with a real healing, both internally and externally.
Ameen. So you already mentioned 3 charities, but what I usually like to ask people is, aside from your own nonprofit, name your top 3 favorite charities.
Well, then there's some bias here because one of my favorites, of course, is, Rahmah Foundation.
Of course. Yep. Full disclosure.
There has to be
to Sheikh Rami Nasur, who runs the organization, which is fine, right?
Yes, so, of course, there's a bias there, but I honestly feel that the work with the prisoners is so needed, right?
Yeah,
and,
of course.
And they are definitely our hidden believers, if you will. So I always reflect on how the ayah of the Quran talks about, and that we feed, right? We give of our charity, right, to the orphan, to the poor, and to the prisoner. And often most people have not tried that route yet.
Right.
In charity.
Right.
Yes. I think growing up, I have a very special place in my heart for a couple of organizations, one of which is Islamic Relief. The reason for that is from early days, at high school, I had been organizing fundraisers for them in our Michigan community.
Yeah, definitely.
Brother Anwar Khan would come out and we'd, put on a whole, right, a fundraiser for whichever country at the moment was in need. And so that time in my life goes back to early teens, right? So that's a special place in my heart for that. And thirdly, there's another place very special to me, which is also in Islamic identity building. So for me, growing up, MINA, or the Muslim Youth of North America, it's been so powerful in shaping that. And just recently, I've reconnected with them. I've been doing some camps and courses with them. And I really feel, when we would hear our parents' generation say, the future is in the youth, we'd all go, oh, yeah, let's, But now that I'm sort of this, I hope, a young auntie, okay? But that's what you'd put me in, category to put me in. There's nothing more true. So investing in our youth as well.
For sure. And, I think that's a great juxtaposition of like, you have these long-standing 25, 30, 40-year-old organizations and institutions. And then you have places like the Khalil Center and the Muslim Mental Health Lab and AMCF and Rahmah Foundation that are like just splitting up the work, right? There's so many needs to be done, and we're able to then focus in these different segments to benefit the community.
Right.
So
like niche specialties, yeah.
Right, exactly. Right. I'm excited to see kind of like when I become a young uncle, where the rest of it will be at and how the community is continuing to evolve. Right. So I always like to close by asking our guest, what's your favorite verse or story from scripture, or you can use a Quranic ayah or a hadith, whatever inspiration you'd like to share.
Yeah, my favorite definitely is, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and if my servants ask you about me, then say I am near. And to me, that is so powerful. And I think a lot of us over time, just the ups and downs of life, we kind of lose sight of that sometimes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is right there with us, always, overseeing everything and everyone. as much as we think things are so big and it's disproportionate to his grandness, right? And I also, because of the work I do in the space of mental health, specifically with Muslim people, who often whose faith is kind of the rope that they hold on to, if you will, right? And people of faith backgrounds, this is true of all faith backgrounds, but this is a verse that I think really helps everybody in a pinch, to remember that there is more out there beyond what they're seeing right now. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability to kind of move and open up everything if we were to tune into that.
For sure. And I think that's exactly what I needed to hear in this moment right now too. And it's just something that you can be as cynical as you want, but there's, at least for me, being a faith-based person, like there's so much to that point as well. So I really thank you for sharing that as well.
Absolutely. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the end of that verse is, and that He accepts the du'as of the supplicant. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our du'as this Ramadan, and really heal us both internally but also externally with COVID and everything else around us. May inshallah may be a real deep cleanse and healing for all of us. Ameen.
Ameen. Thank you so much. I'm so honored that you shared your time with us, and looking forward to continuing to see the great work that you're doing in the community. So again, just thank you for being here.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, Muhi.
All right. Take care.
Assalamu alaikum.
Cool. It stopped.